created an affordability level for secondary and higher education, which had also never existed before. So again, there's this tension that is always existing between espousing and promoting democratic values and making things equitable in society to economic and business interests, and what group of people will get its share of the pie.
As we get bigger and bigger. You are watching What Wise Women Want on Charlottesville Public Access Television, Comcast Channel 13. I'm Dr. Daria Brzezinski, and today we're talking about the history of education. As you can see, this topic is huge and vast, and it's in relationship to many different things. On our panel today, if you'd like to learn more information, you can go to our website and find out more about our panelists, who are, to my right, Ann Spreen, Associate Professor of UVA Comparative Education Policy; Patrice Grimes, the Associate Professor, UVA Curriculum and Instruction; and Pamela Tucker, UVA Professor, Educational Leadership. Okay, so gosh, there's so many directions I want to go at this point. So, all right, so how did we get to the time spent units and curriculum, which is what really galvanized this, sort of unity in all the schools? Well, kind of, sort of, let's put it that way. So how did we start to develop the time spent units and the core curriculum and those kinds of things historically? Now, I heard the Committee of 12 in 1899 were the ones who standardized core curriculum. And in 1908, the National Education Association sponsored, or Andrew Carnegie sponsored a conference, and they all adopted the Carnegie units, which was 120 credit hours. Now, even in those days, now we're talking about time spent units, and those are how the day is broken up according to the subject matter. So we have, and it varies in different parts of the country, but even back then, people realized you could use time differently. So each school, they broke it down into several different areas. You could do 40 weeks at 3 periods of 60 minutes, or 4 periods of 45 minutes, or 5 periods of 36. So they knew that you could use time differently, and they at least allowed a little bit of deviation in terms of those kinds of things. But boy, have we become really standard nationwide. And you keep telling me about the different states being different and locale. I mean, I've traveled all over the country and visited schools all over the country. There is such diversity here. The idea that everybody follows the same rules in some sense seems at times ridiculous to me. So let's talk about how this all developed.
There were 2 schools of thought that John Dewey was a part of. It was the progressive education, and he's considered to be the father of progressive education, versus the traditional education, which is more of what you've talked about. And there was this huge shift at the turn of the 20th century where John Dewey very much felt that education should be child-centered and that children should learn by doing. And being at the University of Chicago, he was able to make connections with U.S. Steel. And in 1906, he literally had a huge system of schooling in Gary, Indiana, that was funded by U.S. Steel. And they were laboratory schools, so to speak, but it was his grand experiment, and it was called the Gary Plan.
Right.
So that children would work and play and study. They would have split shifts, and it was just something that was just very inventive. But by 1920, it had fizzled because they tried to implement it in other parts of the country, specifically New York City, and people voted it down and said they didn't want it. So I think for all the different elements that are involved, there's always this tension between progressive education focusing on the child, more traditional education focusing on this common core set of values. And that's something that we've had literally for 100 years. And then from that evolved this notion of standardized testing, that
Right.
Leland Stanford was the one who decided that standardized testing was important, and around that then became IQ tests. And so people think about testing now with what we do, but in fact that's a concept that's really almost 100 years old. But more importantly to me, we kind of have to step back and go, so how do these things come about in cycles?
Right.
And I go back to, as more people have access to education, as people from different experiences and countries and situations are learning and growing, as we're getting this educated citizenry, there seems to be a point in time when something goes, well, now what? Now wait, let's stop. Maybe we need to test people. Maybe we need to track people. Maybe we need to see who's really ready to be educated and who's not. And so it's this wave of push and pull to me in society. When people are moving along and doing that, then something comes up and there's either an interruption or there's something that makes people kind of pull back. I mean, another example of that I think about is with 1954 in Brown v. Board of Education, when it was declared that separate schools were not equal. There was a huge infusion starting in the 60s in spite of massive resistance in the South for things that were happening. And many people feel in the 1970s that schooling was probably more the ideal of what it could have been at any point in time. But then in 1980, Ronald Reagan came in, and with a report called A Nation at Risk, he said maybe we've tried to do too much in too little time, and maybe we need to pull back. And so there's kind of an ebb and a flow and an ebb and a flow. And I know both of you in your areas have seen that too.
Do you want to jump in?
You go ahead. Go ahead.
So I mean, I think it's really important to go back to the complexity of these debates between like progressive education and also kind of a more...
Kind of define progressive education a little bit for people.
So progressive education, according to Dewey, as Patrice started to allude to, the idea that you should learn with your hands, education should be experiential, the tactile piece of learning, that it should be connected to real world experiences. And that was Dewey's idea, like play should be a central part of education, that we should embrace the whole child and look at different experiences that they could have in the classroom that would enrich the things they have and or do well, and also identify where their weaknesses are and work with them in that way. And that's very fundamentally different than people who look at teaching and education as a technical exercise with very specific ways that you can affect and measure education. And
very different.
Huge debates that were happening at this time. I mean, Dewey was at Columbia, also at Teachers College, and there were a number of people at that time having debates about the practical side versus the kind of removed theoretical side versus how much we can control education through specific mechanisms of the curriculum.
They even called it a life adjustment curriculum at one point in time, and people felt that in teaching students the practical elements of life that it was watering down the curriculum. And so that's where there was always this constant tension of wanting to have things more specific to be measured so that there would be some sort of basis that people could judge people's educational outcomes.
From my perspective, that looks like it's watering it down even more. The more we, train minuscule types of areas, it seems to me that waters it down more and more and more.
Well, let's talk about that in relation to today in a minute.
Go ahead,
but I just think there's this other piece, though, of one of the reasons why Dewey's stuff was tossed out was also from people from the more progressive element were saying you can't align education too much with industry standards. You can't have businesses running schools.
There you go.
You can't make schools kind of training grounds for factories. We have to have a broader purpose of education too. So Dewey was really misused in many ways in massive debates within vocational education about what is the purpose of vocational education, how much should we partner with businesses, how much should businesses dictate what the content of that curriculum and that learning experience should be, and who was behind the promotion of secondary education and mass expansion of schooling. A lot of the Business Roundtable and a lot of people from those communities, and the pushback came from educators who were more interested in the whole child issue and how do we educate people for a society to meet these other demands, not just economic growth issues. And I think it raises the issue of today where we are with our notion that education is something that you can easily measure in a really effective way that's fair, that's equitable, and that we have this sense that a standardized test score is the accurate way of doing that, and that we can actually calibrate schools to align with competitive needs of society, of the global society, and that if schools don't perform according to that, we should shut them down, right? This is the way that we've started to think about education in a very individualistic, private investment, and we've stepped away from thinking about what's the broader purpose of education. Why do we have kids in school learning? Is it just to pass this particular test? Is school about growing the economy and international competitiveness? Or is it about what kind of society we want and how do we have that? And if we have if you get only what you test,
Yes.
then you're only going to teach to that test. So I think thinking about those things is what we should do.
Pamela, what were you going to say? Were you going to? Okay.
No, I wasn't going to jump in there. Carol Ann is quite eloquent to that issue, I think.
I would add, though, that in the African American communities, and keeping in mind that in all of this time that schools, for the most part, are segregated in the United States, and it's not only African Americans, but it's Native Americans who are segregated in Western states. It's still in many places women are not being allowed to go to and attend school. And there was a huge debate around this time with W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington in terms of should we have classical education, which would mirror more of Dewey's philosophies, or should we have industrial education, which was more Washington. And so they actually weren't nearly as far apart on many things as I think they've been portrayed, but still the sense of how do people determine what is the best route to use the knowledge and the learning that they have for their lives.
Well, I think, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and an interesting thing to think about is how vocational education ended up being a very tracked system and disassociated from thinking of, I mean, because it became associated with mass expansion of secondary education along with the civil rights movement and integration of schools, the vocational track became for working class kids and African American kids and Latino kids. So vocational ed ended up being siphoned off to serve those needs and interests instead of being something, I mean, if you look at a country like Finland today or many other countries that have much more flexibility and mobility across both of those systems, they look at vocational ed as something that is, there's no negative status that's associated with it. And it's the same with how we've tracked schools. You know, we have many tiers of learning within schools that have basically disassociated kids from rigorous learning within a school building. I mean, so across schools we have a lot of variation, but also within schools. And part of this is how we would keep certain families in schools, how we keep certain kids in certain places. And those are big issues for how...
I think part of the stigma for my personal knowledge of the history of education, I think part of the stigma of vocational ed comes from where the curriculum actually came from. And are you familiar with that? It came from the Department of Corrections. And so the stigma of vocation, the roots of it were in 1789, a clergyman, William Rogers, at the Philadelphia Walnut Street jail, and then Elmira, New York, the reformatory of the IPI formulated there. And so all these reforms in terms of the Department of Corrections and what school districts decided was, and the superintendent of schools in general of the United States decided if it works in the corrections and at this stressful situation, then it must be good for the mainstream. And I think that stigma has, bringing it from corrections into the educational system in America, whereas everybody was gearing towards college and that level. I think that has, to this day, and I think about it, who is being trained in these schools, but mechanics and electricians and plumbers. And when I think of what my plumber and my electrician make, why are we, why is manual labor considered something less than, they make good money an hour. So in my estimation, maybe that's where I don't know it to be true, but in my estimation, perhaps the stigma for VOTEC comes from having it brought in from the Department of Corrections. So anyway, let's go back to, wow, there's so many topics. Let's get into how corporations have infiltrated the schools. And gosh, we don't have a whole lot of time, but so let's talk about how corporations have infiltrated schools. I remember from the very get-go, we had corporations coming in with the Texa McGuffey reader and, even the Sears and Roebuck catalog. If you didn't have a lot of money in your school district, they used the Sears and Roebuck catalog for reading and for math. So let's look, everybody thinks corporations have infiltrated schools only in the modern era, and it's not really true. So let's talk about corporations and their impact on the schools. Anyone like to begin that conversation? Well,
earlier I mentioned the Gary Plan, and particularly because schools were locally funded. If corporations were willing to put schools in towns and communities, then people saw that as a way for their children to be educated. But again, that had a yin and a yang, because the corporation or the company town then influenced and controlled the schooling, which determined what children learned. And there was a huge backlash. I mean, Harold Rugg, particularly in the 1940s, saw all of that as being very detrimental, because he saw it being a system where children were only being trained to serve the needs of people who amassed the money and had the power. And so he really began to question and wrote about it, but was not nearly as vocal in many ways, because he didn't have the channels to get his information out in the 1940s as other kinds of people. As we move to more recent times, and specifically I referenced Ronald Reagan and A Nation at Risk in the 1980s,